The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the small estate sale house in Salem, Massachusetts, as antique appraiser Margaret Collins carefully examined the contents of the Whitmore family's belongings. The elderly patriarch had passed 3 months prior, leaving behind a modest but well-appointed home filled with decades of memories. Margaret had seen countless such sales, families parting with their histories, one photograph and trinket at a time. She moved methodically through the dining room, cataloging items with practiced efficiency. Silver candlesticks, china plates, leather-bound books, all typical remnants of a 19th century American household. But it was the small mahogany secretary desk in the corner that caught her attention. Its intricate brass fittings and hand-carved details suggested it was worth examining more closely. As Margaret opened the desk's drawers, her fingers discovered a hidden compartment behind the main writing surface. The secret panel slid away with a soft click, revealing a single daguerreotype photograph wrapped in yellowed cloth. The image was remarkably well preserved, showing a stern-faced man in his 30s standing beside a young boy of perhaps 10 years old. Both were dressed in the formal attire of the 1870s, the man in a dark wool coat and vest, the boy in knickers and a sailor-style shirt. What immediately struck Margaret as unusual was the boy's expression. While his father stood rigid and serious, as was customary for photographs of that era, the child's face bore something she'd rarely seen in daguerreotypes, a look of profound sadness, almost fear. His small hands were clenched at his sides, and his eyes seemed to be looking not at the camera, but at something just beyond the frame. Margaret turned the photograph over and found an inscription in faded ink. Thomas Whitmore and son Samuel. Salem, October 1874. May God forgive us both. The unusual nature of the inscription sent a chill down her spine. Why would someone write such words on what should have been a simple family portrait? She examined the image more closely with her magnifying glass. The clarity was exceptional for a photograph of that period, allowing her to see minute details that would normally be lost. And then she saw it, something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, barely visible in the background behind the subjects, was what appeared to be a woman's hand, reaching from behind a curtain, as if she were trying to signal for help. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set the photograph down. In 30 years of appraising antiques, she had never encountered anything quite like this. The fear in the boy's eyes, the cryptic inscription, and now, this mysterious hand in the background, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple family portrait. Margaret couldn't shake the image from her mind as she drove home through the winding streets of Salem that evening. The photograph sat carefully secured in her briefcase, but its contents haunted her thoughts. She had originally planned to include it with the other family memorabilia for the estate auction, but something told her this daguerreotype deserved deeper investigation. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Salem Historical Society, a brick building that had served as the town's repository of local history for over a century. She hoped the archives might contain some record of Thomas Whitmore and his family. The head librarian, Eleanor Hartwell, was a woman in her 70s who had spent decades preserving Salem's past. Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor mused, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she considered Margaret's request. The name is familiar, but I can't quite place it. Let me check our census records and newspaper archives from the 1870s. As Eleanor disappeared into the stacks, Margaret examined the photograph again under better lighting. The more she studied the boy's face, the more convinced she became that young Samuel was trying to communicate something through his expression. His eyes held a desperate quality that seemed to plead directly with the camera, and anyone who might look at the image in years to come. Eleanor returned with an armload of leather-bound volumes and loose newspaper clippings. I found several references to the Whitmore family, she announced, settling the materials on the large oak reading table. Thomas Whitmore was indeed a resident of Salem in the 1870s. He owned a small textile mill on the outskirts of town and was considered a respectable member of the community. Margaret leaned forward as Eleanor opened the first volume. But here's what's interesting, the librarian continued, pointing to a newspaper clipping from November 1874. Just 1 month after your photograph was taken, there was a brief mention in the Salem Gazette about Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore's sudden departure from town. The article states that she left to care for an ailing relative in Boston, but, Margaret prompted, sensing there was more to the story. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. Well, it struck me as odd because there's no mention of her ever returning. And look at this. She opened another volume to reveal the 1880 census records. While Thomas Whitmore is listed as a widower, living alone with his son, Samuel. No mention of Elizabeth anywhere, and no death certificate in our local records. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. A woman who disappeared just weeks after a photograph, showing a mysterious hand reaching from behind a curtain. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Is there anything else about the family in your records? Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded grimly. That's where things get even more peculiar. Young Samuel Whitmore left Salem abruptly in 1885, when he would have been about 21 years old. He never returned, and there's no record of him maintaining contact with his father. Thomas lived alone until his death in 1902. Armed with this new information, Margaret decided to expand her research beyond Salem's borders. If Samuel Whitmore had left town in 1885, there might be records of where he had gone and why he had severed ties with his father so completely. Her first stop was the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston, where she hoped to find immigration records, employment documents, or other traces of Samuel's life after he left Salem. The train ride gave her time to study the photograph once more, and she noticed something she had missed before: a small, dark stain on the boy's white shirt collar, barely visible but definitely present. At the archives, a helpful clerk named David Morrison assisted her in searching through boxes of records from the 1880s. They combed through employment registers, ship passenger lists, and even early telephone directories, looking for any mention of Samuel Whitmore. Their breakthrough came in an unexpected place: the records of a Catholic charity organization in Boston. In 1886, a year after leaving Salem, Samuel had apparently sought help from the Sisters of Mercy, who operated a shelter for displaced young men. The intake record described him as a young man of good character but troubled mind, seeking refuge from unnamed family difficulties. "This is fascinating," David remarked, reading over Margaret's shoulder. "Look at this note from Sister Mary Catherine, who interviewed him. She wrote, 'The young man speaks little of his past, but bears the weight of some terrible knowledge. He flinches when asked about his family and shows signs of having witnessed great trauma.'" Margaret's heart raced as she read the nun's observations. This was the first concrete evidence that Samuel had indeed experienced something traumatic in his childhood, something that had driven him to flee his hometown and seek sanctuary with strangers. The records showed that Samuel had worked various jobs in Boston, first as a clerk in a dry goods store, then later as a bookkeeper for a small shipping company. He had been described by employers as hardworking but withdrawn, someone who avoided social situations and rarely spoke of his past. But the most significant discovery came in a letter that Samuel had written to Sister Mary Catherine in 1890, 5 years after arriving in Boston. The letter had been preserved in the charity's files, and its contents sent chills down Margaret's spine. "Dear Sister," the letter began, "I write to you because you are the only person who showed me kindness when I arrived with nothing but the weight of a terrible secret. For 5 years I have carried this burden alone, but I fear it is destroying my soul. I have evidence of a great crime committed by my own father, but I am torn between my duty to justice and my loyalty to family. The photograph I carry shows more than anyone realizes, and I pray daily for guidance on whether I should reveal what I know." The letter was signed simply S. Whitmore and included a forwarding address in Philadelphia, where Samuel had apparently moved to start a new life. Margaret's journey to Philadelphia proved to be the most revealing leg of her investigation. Armed with Samuel's 1890 address, she hoped to find more clues about the evidence he had mentioned in his letter to Sister Mary Catherine. The address led her to a narrow brick row house in what had once been a working-class neighborhood near the Delaware River. The current residents knew nothing about Samuel Whitmore, but they directed Margaret to Mrs. Helen Kowalski, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for over 60 years and remembered many of the neighborhood's former inhabitants. Mrs. Kowalski, now in her 80s, invited Margaret into her small but immaculately kept parlor. Her memory proved to be remarkably sharp, and she recalled Samuel Whitmore quite clearly. "Oh yes, Samuel," she said, settling into her favorite armchair. "He was such a quiet, sad young man when he moved to the street in the 1890s. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always kind to the children. He worked as a bookkeeper for Jameson and Sons, the shipping company down by the wharf." Margaret showed Mrs. Kowalski the daguerreotype, and the elderly woman's expression immediately grew somber. "I remember this photograph," she said slowly. "Samuel showed it to me once, many years ago. He was quite agitated that day, talking about how he couldn't sleep at night because of what he knew. He said this picture held the truth about something terrible that happened to his mother." "Did he tell you what he meant by that?" Margaret asked, leaning forward intently. Mrs. Kowalski nodded gravely. "He said his father had told everyone that his mother had gone away to care for a sick relative, but Samuel knew it wasn't true. He said she had never left Salem at all, that something awful had happened to her in their own home, and this photograph was taken just days afterward." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Did he say what he planned to do with this knowledge?" "That's what troubled him so much," Mrs. Kowalski replied. "He felt torn between protecting his father's reputation and seeking justice for his mother. He told me he had written everything down in a journal, documenting all the evidence he had gathered over the years, but he never knew whether he should come forward with it." The elderly woman paused, seeming to wrestle with a difficult memory. "The last time I spoke with Samuel about this was in 1895. He told me he had made a decision, that he was going to write to the authorities in Salem and tell them everything. He said he couldn't live with the secret anymore, that it was eating him alive from the inside." Margaret's mind raced. If Samuel had indeed written to authorities in Salem in 1895, there might be records of his communication. But first, she needed to find out what had happened to Samuel himself. Mrs. Kowalski's story suggested he had lived in Philadelphia for several years, but his trail seemed to go cold after 1895. "Do you know what became of Samuel after that?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Kowalski's expression grew sad. He moved away shortly after that conversation. Someone said he had gone west, perhaps to California, looking for a fresh start. He never came back to visit, and none of us ever heard from him again, but I always wondered if he had followed through with his plan to contact the authorities. Back in Salem, Margaret approached the investigation with renewed purpose. If Samuel Whitmore had indeed contacted authorities in 1895 with information about his mother's disappearance, there should be some record of it in the police files or court documents of that period. The Salem Police Department's historical records were housed in the basement of the current station, a cramped space filled with boxes of case files dating back to the 1800s. Detective Ray Sullivan, a young officer with an interest in local history, helped Margaret navigate the archives. 1895, Detective Sullivan mused, pulling several dusty boxes from the metal shelving. That would be during Chief Morrison's tenure. He was known for keeping meticulous records, so if something came in, it should be here. They spent hours combing through incident reports, correspondence, and case files before Margaret found what she was looking for. Tucked inside a folder marked Anonymous Tips and Correspondence was a letter dated March 15, 1895. Written in the same careful handwriting she had seen in Samuel's letter to Sister Mary Catherine, the letter was addressed to Chief Morrison and began, "Sir, I write to you concerning a crime that has gone unpunished for over 20 years. I have knowledge of the disappearance of Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore in October 1874, and I believe her husband, Thomas Whitmore, was responsible for her death." Margaret's hands trembled as she read Samuel's detailed account. He described how, as a 10-year-old boy, he had witnessed his father striking his mother during a violent argument on the night of October 20th, 1874. According to Samuel's letter, Elizabeth Whitmore had discovered evidence that her husband had been embezzling money from his textile mill's workers' wages. When she confronted him, the argument had escalated into violence. Samuel's account continued. "Watched from the top of the stairs as my father struck my mother with such force that she fell and struck her head against the fireplace hearth. I thought she was dead, but then I saw her hand move, reaching toward the parlor where we kept our family portraits. She was trying to signal something, but my father didn't see it. He was already planning what to tell people about her departure to Boston." The letter went on to describe how Thomas Whitmore had forced his young son to participate in staging the photograph just 2 days later, claiming they needed a memento before Elizabeth's journey. But Samuel had positioned himself and his mother, who was apparently still alive but severely injured, and hidden behind the curtain, in such a way that her reaching hand would be captured in the background of the image. "My mother died 3 days later from her injuries," Samuel wrote. "My father buried her somewhere on our property and told everyone she had left town. I was only 10 years old and too frightened to speak the truth, but I have carried this burden for 21 years. The photograph shows my mother's final attempt to leave evidence of what happened to her." Detective Sullivan whistled low as he finished reading. "This is incredible. Did Chief Morrison act on this information?" Margaret searched through the remaining files and found Morrison's response. Dated March 22, 1895. The chief had taken Samuel's accusations seriously enough to conduct a discreet investigation, but by the time he attempted to locate Samuel for further questioning, the young man had already left Philadelphia. Without Samuel's direct testimony, there wasn't enough evidence to pursue the case against Thomas Whitmore. Margaret's discovery of Samuel's letter had provided compelling testimony, but she knew that any modern investigation would require physical evidence. The former Whitmore property had been sold several times over the decades, but the original house and grounds were still intact, now serving as a small bed and breakfast called the Salem Rose Inn. She approached the current owners, Jack and Linda Morrison, no relation to the former police chief, with her findings. Initially skeptical, they became increasingly interested as Margaret shared the historical documents and the haunting daguerreotype. As amateur history enthusiasts themselves, they were both fascinated and horrified by the possibility that their property might be connected to a century-old murder. "If there's truth to this story," Jack Morrison said, studying the photograph with a magnifying glass, "we need to know. Linda and I have always felt there was something unsettling about the back garden area. Guests occasionally comment on it too. They say it feels different from the rest of the grounds." With the Morrisons' permission, Margaret contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeologist from Boston University who specialized in historical forensics. Dr. Chen agreed to bring ground-penetrating radar equipment to survey the property, a non-invasive technique that could detect underground anomalies without disturbing the landscaping. The survey took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 149 years after Elizabeth Whitmore's alleged murder. Dr. Chen and her graduate student assistant, Michael Torres, methodically moved the radar equipment across the back garden, paying particular attention to areas that might have been accessible to someone wanting to bury something secretly in 1874. "There," Dr. Chen announced, pointing to a reading on her computer screen. "We're getting a significant anomaly here, about 4 feet down. The soil density is completely different from the surrounding area, and there are what appear to be foreign objects. possibly fabric or leather that has preserved over time. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she stared at the radar image. After 149 years, Elizabeth Whitmore might finally be found. The Morrisons immediately contacted the Salem Police Department, and within hours, Detective Sullivan arrived with a forensics team and the necessary permits to begin a careful excavation. Word of the discovery had somehow leaked to the local media, and by afternoon, reporters and curious townspeople had gathered behind the police barriers that now surrounded the Salem Rose Inn. As the forensics team began their methodical dig, Margaret couldn't help but think about Samuel Whitmore, the frightened 10-year-old boy who had carried this terrible secret for his entire life. His desperate attempt to leave evidence in the family photograph had finally, after nearly a century and a half, led to this moment of potential justice for his mother. Dr. Chen supervised every aspect of the excavation, ensuring that any evidence was preserved according to modern forensic standards. At a depth of just over 4 feet, the team's careful brushing revealed the first trace of what they were looking for, a fragment of dark fabric that appeared consistent with women's clothing from the 1870s. The excavation continued for 3 days, with Dr. Chen's team working in careful 6-inch layers to preserve any evidence that might have survived in the New England soil. Margaret remained at the site throughout, watching as each brushstroke potentially brought Elizabeth Whitmore closer to the justice that had eluded her for nearly 150 years. On the 3rd day, the team made their most significant discovery. Wrapped in what remained of a dark wool shawl, they found a collection of items that seemed to corroborate Samuel's account. A woman's brass locket engraved with the initials EW, several buttons that matched the style worn in 1870s women's dresses, and most remarkably, a small leather journal that had been preserved by the alkaline soil conditions. Dr. Chen carefully extracted the journal and transported it to her laboratory at Boston University, where conservation specialists could attempt to read its contents without damaging the fragile pages. The process took several weeks, during which Margaret found herself checking her phone constantly for updates. The call finally came on a Tuesday evening in November. "Margaret," Dr. Chen's excited voice came through the phone, "you need to come see this immediately. The journal, we were able to recover significant portions of the text, and it changes everything we thought we knew about this case." Margaret drove to Boston the next morning, her mind racing with possibilities. At the university laboratory, Dr. Chen led her to a climate-controlled room where the journal lay open under specialized lighting, its pages now legible after careful treatment. "The journal belonged to Elizabeth Whitmore," Dr. Chen explained, "and the entries span from early 1874 up until just days before her death. But here's what's remarkable. She wasn't just a victim. She was conducting her own investigation into her husband's business practices and had discovered something much larger than simple embezzlement." Margaret leaned over the journal as Dr. Chen pointed to a preserved entry dated September 1874. "I have uncovered evidence that Thomas has been systematically cheating not only his workers but also several prominent Salem families who invested in the mill expansion. The amounts are staggering, enough to ruin dozens of families if the truth came out. But more troubling still, I have discovered correspondence suggesting he may be involved with others in similar schemes throughout Massachusetts." Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, was even more damning. "Thomas has realized I know about his crimes. He grows more agitated each day, and I fear for my safety and Samuel's. I have hidden copies of all the evidence in case something happens to me. If I am found dead, they must know it was not an accident or illness." Dr. Chen turned to another section of the journal. "And here's the most crucial part," she said. "Elizabeth Whitmore documented exactly where she hid her evidence, and it wasn't buried with her. According to this final entry, she concealed the documents in a hidden compartment she created in the family Bible, which she gave to Samuel for safekeeping just days before her death." Margaret's mind immediately went to the estate sale where she had found the daguerreotype. "The Bible," she whispered. "It might still be in the house. We need to contact the estate sale company immediately." Margaret's phone call to the estate sale company came just in time. The Whitmore family Bible was scheduled to be sold the following day to a private collector who specialized in 19th century religious texts. After explaining the situation to the estate company's manager, Margaret was able to examine the Bible that afternoon. The large leather-bound volume was typical of family Bibles from the 1870s, with thick pages and ornate illustrations. But as Margaret carefully examined its construction, she noticed that the back cover seemed slightly thicker than the front. Following Elizabeth Whitmore's journal instructions, she gently probed along the edges until she found a nearly invisible seam. With trembling hands, Margaret carefully opened the hidden compartment that Elizabeth had created 149 years earlier. Inside, preserved in oiled cloth, was a collection of documents that would have sent shockwaves through Salem society in 1874. The papers included detailed financial records showing how Thomas Whitmore had systematically embezzled from his textile mill, forged documents to hide his crimes, and coordinated with accomplices in other towns to run similar schemes. But most shocking of all was a letter from a prominent Salem businessman, offering to help Thomas cover up his crimes in exchange for a share of the stolen money. Margaret photographed every document before turning them over to Detective Sullivan. The evidence painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond a single-family tragedy. It revealed a network of financial crimes that had affected dozens of families throughout the region. This explains why Samuel was so torn about coming forward, Detective Sullivan observed as he reviewed the documents. He wasn't just exposing his father's crimes, he was threatening to bring down several of Salem's most respected citizens. Among the documents was also a letter that Elizabeth had written to Samuel, apparently intended to be found with the evidence. In it, she explained why she had involved her young son in the family photograph. "My dearest Samuel, if you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass. I arranged for our photograph to be taken not as a memento, but as evidence. I knew that if something happened to me, you would be the only witness to the truth." The photographer captured more than Thomas realized. My hand reaching from behind the curtain was my way of pointing toward the parlor where I hid this evidence. I pray that someday, when you're old enough to understand, you will find these documents and ensure that justice is served not only for me, but for all the families Thomas has harmed. The letter continued. I do not blame you for whatever fear or confusion you may feel about revealing this truth. You are just a child, and I should never have placed such a burden on your young shoulders. But know that your mother loves you and wants only for you to be free from the weight of these secrets. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading Elizabeth's final words to her son. The love and sacrifice in the letter made the tragedy even more poignant. A mother trying to protect her child while also ensuring that justice would eventually prevail. With the physical evidence now in hand, Margaret felt compelled to discover what had ultimately happened to Samuel Whitmore. His trail had gone cold after 1895, when he left Philadelphia for the American West, but modern genealogical databases and digitized records offered new possibilities for tracking his later life. Working with a professional genealogist named Robert Hayes, Margaret searched through census records, military service files, and newspaper archives from across the western United States. Their breakthrough came when they found Samuel listed in the 1900 census in Sacramento, California, working as a bookkeeper for a lumber company. Further research revealed that Samuel had indeed started a new life in California, eventually marrying a schoolteacher named Mary Patterson in 1902 and raising 3 children. But most remarkably, they discovered that Samuel had not forgotten his mission to seek justice for his mother. In 1925, at the age of 61, he had written a detailed account of his childhood experiences and sent it to several newspapers in Massachusetts, hoping that someone would finally investigate his allegations. The Sacramento Bee had published Samuel's story in a series of articles titled A Son's Quest for Justice. The Salem Murder That Time Forgot, the newspaper account provided additional details about the night of Elizabeth's death and Samuel's years of carrying the burden of what he had witnessed. According to the newspaper account, Samuel had never fully recovered from the trauma of his childhood. He suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and anxiety throughout his adult life, but he had channeled his pain into helping others, volunteering with organizations that assisted children who had witnessed domestic violence. Margaret was able to contact Samuel's great-granddaughter, Jennifer Whitmore Chen. She had married into a Chinese-American family who still lived in Sacramento. Jennifer was amazed to learn about the recent discovery in Salem and the role her great-great-grandmother's journal had played in finally revealing the truth. Great-grandfather Samuel talked about Salem. Sometimes when I was young, Jennifer told Margaret during their phone conversation. He always said there was unfinished business there, something about making sure the truth came out about his mother. He kept that old photograph until the day he died in 1958, and he made my grandmother promise to preserve it for future generations. Jennifer also revealed that Samuel had continued documenting evidence throughout his life, compiling a comprehensive file about his father's crimes and their long-term impact on Salem's community. He never gave up hope that someday someone would be able to use his evidence to set the record straight, she explained. Most touchingly, Jennifer shared that Samuel had written a letter to be opened only after his death, in which he expressed his hope that his mother would finally receive a proper burial and recognition as a victim of domestic violence, rather than a woman who had abandoned her family. The culmination of Margaret's investigation came on a cold December morning in Salem, exactly 149 years and 2 months after Elizabeth Whitmore's murder. The Salem City Council had voted to hold an official ceremony acknowledging Elizabeth as a victim of domestic violence and recognizing Samuel's courage in preserving evidence of his father's crimes, despite the personal cost. Elizabeth's remains, which had been carefully studied by forensic experts, were finally given a proper burial in Salem's historic Chestnut Street Cemetery. The headstone, paid for by donations from the community, read, Elizabeth Whitmore, 1835 to 1874, loving mother and seeker of truth. Her voice, silenced by violence, finally speaks through the love of her son. Representatives from several domestic violence organizations attended the ceremony, noting how Elizabeth's story illustrated both the historical prevalence of domestic abuse and the importance of believing and supporting those who witnessed such crimes. Samuel's great-granddaughter Jennifer traveled from California to attend, bringing with her the original daguerreotype and several other family documents that Samuel had preserved. Detective Sullivan announced that the Salem Police Department would be reopening several cold cases from the 1870s, using Samuel's evidence to investigate the broader network of financial crimes that Thomas Whitmore had been involved in. While the perpetrators were long dead, the investigation might provide closure for descendants of other families who had suffered financial losses during that period. Margaret donated the daguerreotype to the Salem Historical Society, where it would be displayed as part of an exhibit about domestic violence in 19th century America. Eleanor Hartwell, the head librarian, noted that Elizabeth and Samuel's story demonstrated how historical artifacts could continue to reveal new truths long after their creation. But perhaps the most moving moment of the ceremony came when Jennifer Whitmore Chen read aloud a letter that Samuel had written shortly before his death in 1958. In it, he expressed his hope that his mother's story would someday inspire others to speak out against injustice, even when doing so required great personal courage. "I spent my entire life carrying the weight of what I witnessed as a child," Samuel had written, "but I learned that silence in the face of evil only allows that evil to continue. My mother's courage in documenting her husband's crimes, even knowing it might cost her life, showed me that some truths are too important to keep hidden. I pray that her story will encourage others to find their voice, to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." As the ceremony concluded and the attendees began to disperse, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had started with a simple estate sale discovery. A single photograph, taken under the most tragic circumstances, had preserved a family's truth for nearly 150 years until the right person came along to understand its message. Elizabeth Whitmore's hand, reaching desperately from behind that curtain in 1874, had finally succeeded in pointing the way to justice. And Samuel, the frightened 10-year-old boy whose eyes had pleaded with the camera, had ultimately found the courage to ensure that his mother's truth would not die with him. The daguerreotype now stood in the Salem Historical Society not just as an artifact of the past, but as a testament to the power of love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. In preserving that single moment of desperation and hope, the photograph had become something its subjects never intended, a bridge across time that allowed justice to finally prevail.